So, this screencast is a couple of things that you can do to or start doing to help improve your grammar and your mechanics. The first thing that I want to talk about is the power of punctuation. I gave you some rules for commas, and you all know the different forms of punctuation that you can use in your writing. But I don't know if you've ever really thought about the punctuation is a choice, and it's something that can be used to improve your style. And I wanted to kind of show you the power of punctuation with this Dear Jack letter. So if I ask you um, to edit this letter and to add punctuation in, um, what you would do is you would go in and you would automatically kind of recognize that this is a love letter. Dear Jack, I want a man who knows what love is all about. Well, it would help if I'm doing it correctly. All about. You are generous, kind, and thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. We're going to give that one a exclamation point. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we're apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Jill? So I've just gone in and I've done some basic editing here with just some commas, adding them in the proper places. But with just some simple shifts, I can turn this love letter into a hate letter. It's a hate letter is so much more fun. But with just a couple of shifts in, and just to show you that punctuation can be powerful if it's purposeful, is that I can move some things around and I can actually make this letter a hate letter. I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, and thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men, I yearn. For you, I have no feelings whatsoever. When we're apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be? Yours, Jill. And you can see that I didn't change any wording. All I did was change my punctuation and how I used it. Punctuation is a powerful style tool. And when you know the rules for grammar, when you know the rules for commas and punctuation, you can make those purposeful moves. But on the flip side of that, when you're using commas incorrectly, it can shift your entire meaning, just like this is. I changed this entire letter from a love letter to a hate letter, just by shifting around the punctuation that I'm using. So it just goes to show you that using punctuation should be purposeful, it should be well thought out, and you should always follow the rules of grammar and mechanics. I gave you also a couple of things that I wanted you to take a look at. Just some sentence patterns that would help, and some sentence lifts that you can use in your writing. I gave you 2 pages of patterns for coordination and subordination. And if you will see here, I've got 3 different options for coordination for you to use. Coordination is when you're using independent clauses connected together, and the patterns that you can use to do that. So for option number 1, I have an independent clause on one side. I join it together with a comma and a conjunction. Those fanboys for and nor but or yet so. And I follow it with an independent clause. Remember that independent clauses are complete thoughts. They can stand as sentences by themselves. Remember also, if you read over the comma rules, that you can't stick two independent clauses together with just a comma. That's called a splice. So if you got a splice error on your last paper, that's what it was for. The second option is when you have an independent clause connected to another independent clause with a semicolon. Now, the semicolon is usually used to connect sentences of like construction, like content. You want to use the semicolon sparingly in that case to join sentences together. The third option, and something that I'm actually seeing in a couple of your papers, is when you use a conjunctive adverb. So, an independent clause with a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb like consequently, however, in fact, nevertheless, using a comma after that, and then the other independent clause. On the flip side of that is subordination. Remember that if someone is subordinate to someone, they are under them in some way. Your employer, you are subordinate to your employer. And so I always like to think of this as kind of like the mama and the baby. An independent clause kind of acts as a mama in a sentence. Okay, you don't want to take away the baby from the mama. So therefore, you don't want to use any kind of punctuation to separate in this option the dependent clause, the baby, from the mama. So for this pattern, you use an independent clause connected with a subordinate conjunction after although, because, unless, whenever, followed by a dependent clause. Now, a dependent clause cannot stand by itself as a sentence. It would be a fragment if it was left on its own. So it has to have that independent clause in order to make sense. The final option is for a dependent independent clause pattern. So starting a sentence with a dependent clause, you use a word after although, before, since, unless, whenever, while, followed by your dependent clause, a comma, and then the independent clause. This is for like an introductory phrase or clause that is dependent upon the independent clause for meaning. The last document that I share with you is something that it will help you strengthen your writing if you learn to recognize these grammatical structures. So you've got these patterns. They're called sentence lifts. An isocolon is a Greek word. It means equal phrases. That's when you have a pair of clauses of roughly equal length joined together by a comma, semicolon, or conjunction. Remember, you can't just join them together with a comma because it would be a splice. It would have to have a subordinate conjunction clause or a fanboy construction, conjunctive adverb construction. However, I saw countless tough guys locked away. I've since buried several. Two independent clauses of roughly equal length adjoined by the semicolon. We will not rest. We cannot think of anything else. Two closely related, joining them together with the semicolon. Those are called isocolons. Then you have a series. Those are something you should be familiar with. When you have a series of items in a sentence, you shape those with commas, you separate them off from each other. That was the language that helped shape the way I saw things, expressed things, and made sense of the world. I don't want yours, I half screamed at her and went crazy, tearing up the house, crawling under the couch, yanking out drawers. It's items in a series, grammatically identical elements strung together in a sentence. Congeries are a pile of words. They're usually descriptive, and they are a steady accumulation of details. And this screencast is about to go off, so I'll pick back up in just a second.